Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I hope you're staying safe at home, and I hope you have checked the the previous video and that we have finished with chapter 2. And I hope it was all clear with you. Let me start now with you, chapter 3, which is about the inter-organizational context of public administration. So far, we have taken in chapter 1 what is public administration and so on. And then we moved on to talk about chapter 2, the political context, where we mainly focused on the public policy process with its different types. And now we are moving on to talk about a different context, which is the inter-organizational context of public administration. Okay? For this chapter, let's think together. When we are speaking about public programs, okay, we usually say that the public program's effectiveness depends on the relationship among various organizations. It's not only the public administrators or the public agencies, but there are other organizations that will be working together with the government to implement its policies. And the success for these programs for sure will depend on such relationship. Let's try to remind ourselves with the public policy process. Do you remember when we spoke about implementation and we said that it's the main responsibility for implementation is for the public sector, but we also said that there are other sectors that can participate in the implementation. And we spoke about the private sector and the NGOs or the civil society organizations. Here, we are speaking about a type of network, what we call network. The government conducts its activities and running its public program through different networks. Some of these networks might be permanent, some of them will be just for doing such an activity and that's it. Some of these networks are formers, others are informers. And that's why managing such network is very hard, because they do not have a hierarchy over each other. Let's take an example to get things clearer. If you are saying that the government is planning to make a public awareness program about encouraging citizens to participate in election, for example. So we said, this was one of the examples that we have mentioned in one of our lectures. We said that maybe it might ask for the help of some of the NGOs to help them in running that program, because many of the people in such NGOs are already they already know many people, they are close to them, so they might help in the implementation process, right? So in that case, that's type of a network, because we're speaking about different actors, maybe different NGOs. And here the government doesn't have a hierarchy over these NGOs in that case. So we could have many groups, many organizations that can be involved in that policy arena. We can have experts who provide us with the information during the policy formulation stage, for example. We could have many actors who will help us in the implementations. We could have many institutes, think tanks that will help us during the evaluation stage. And all of them do not report to a single director. We have different managers, different directors. They are not structured in the hierarchy, like I'm saying. You could have, if you're talking about an evaluation of a policy, you might find a think tank that's evaluating a current policy. You might find the parliament is evaluating a certain policy. You might find some NGOs are evaluating a certain policy, and there's no hierarchy in here. Everyone is working in such, maybe by the end the government is collecting all these efforts to have a look at that kind of evaluation for the program. So these organizations can sometimes loosely join the system. They might lose at a point of time and they might leave another point of time. There could be some kind of overlapping of interest and many duplication of efforts if two different institutions have conducted the same evaluation using the same tools. There could be a duplication of efforts. There could be lack of coordinations. That's what makes the public manager's task different and hard. That's why the effectiveness depends on how we manage the relationship between different organizations and how they interact with the government institutions. Okay? So, from these actors that are involved in the network, in this chapter we will be mainly focusing on the NGOs, the role of the NGOs. Let's just think together. What is the key role that the NGOs can play in the policy process? Try to think for a minute about the different stages that we have covered in chapter 2 of the policy process. Agenda setting, policy formulation, policy legitimation, implementation, and evaluation. So where do you think NGOs can play a role in that process? Okay? Did you thought about it? Okay, let's see. NGOs can actually participate in many of the stages of the public policy process. They may raise issues to the agenda. Maybe one of the NGOs have discovered that some of the rural areas in Aswan, they lack access to clean water. So and then it affected their health, and many people who are living in this area have been infected with different diseases or whatever due to the unclean water. So they started to raise that issue, tried to push for it to be put in on the government agenda. So in that case, that NGOs played a role to put the issue on the government agenda. What else? Do they participate in the formulation stage? Yes, of course. They may also participate in the formulation stage, and maybe through trying to lobby for a particular policy alternative or a particular policy proposal. How is that? Do you remember when we said also during the stages that one of the maybe if you're speaking about an NGOs that is working on women's issues, for example, then they started to raise or looking to write a new law that will giving more rights for women or working women or so on. So they have a proposal, they might submit that proposal to the parliament, and maybe the parliament or the government, they start to discuss that alternative. So they may also participate in the formulation stage. Do they participate in the implementation stage? Of course, they may participate in the implementation stage, and we have just mentioned the example when we said the government might use the help of many of the NGOs in the public awareness campaign, for example. So in that case, they might work with the government when it comes to the implementation. How about evaluation? Do they participate in the evaluation stage? Yes, they can do also. They may participate in the evaluation stage. They may conduct an evaluation by themselves without being asked by the government, because they are actually have a role of following up with the government. Or maybe the government itself might ask the NGOs who are specialized in evaluations or they are experts in that area to do a kind of an evaluation for one of their running programs, for example. So in fact, we can find that many of the NGOs or active NGOs or good working NGOs can actually participate in the different stages of the public policy process. Okay, so if we are talking about, we're gonna cover only two concepts. Under that, we're gonna talk about privatizations, we're gonna talk about public-private partnership. Privatization, what do you mean by privatizations? Usually the broad definition of privatization is that you are trying to remove the government from the involvement in the design or the conduct of a particular service. Or you're trying to use the private sector or the NGOs to directly provide the goods and services that have been used to be provided by the government. So now the government, if the government decides to privatize, so it's refrain from providing the good or service and leave it for the public, for the private sector to be the one responsible for that delivery or production. Why many countries have applied the privatization approach? Actually, many people or many scholars felt like that maybe when private company is running or delivering that service, they may give their customers more attention compared to the government, and might raise competition between them so that they make sure that the higher quality is delivered and the lower cost, because speaking about the private sector was trying to be efficient and trying to deliver their services in a good quality and a lower cost. So by having a competition, not the government providing the service, having many private organizations actually delivering that service, that might raise a competition between them, and in that case that might lead to a lowering the cost and a better quality. Also, some programs may not be appropriate for the government to run, and the private organizations will be able to operate it more efficiently. However, the question here that we have to ask ourselves, is it possible to privatize all government services? Or is it possible to privatize everything the government is doing? Of course not. There are many activities, many programs, and many services that cannot be provided by anyone else but the government. That's why privatization can be done for certain sectors and not other sectors, and that's what we have to be clear about. Okay? Then, what else? Privatization also has its problems, and it has proved many problems, which is not going to be our talk here. We're not going to get into deeper details about it. We just wanted to introduce for you the definitions and why some countries want to be involved in the privatization issues. But we're not going to get into the deep details of it. Just got through the definitions. Then moving on to public-private partnership. Let's try to watch this video together, and maybe by then we can discuss it. Okay, let's see.
Across all infrastructure sectors, water, energy, transport and social services, governments face an ever-growing dilemma. Traditional public procurement falls short of bridging the gap between available public finances and infrastructure development needs, both in advanced and developing countries. However, there is a way out. Public-private partnerships. Let's illustrate this with a concrete example. Imagine you have just taken office as a public decision maker. The first thing you would like to improve is the municipal drinking water provision, which has been neglected in the past due to the enormous task that it presents: building and efficiently managing the municipal water and sewage infrastructure. To tackle this challenge, you decide to share not only the construction of the municipal water and sewage system, but also its financing and its operation with the private sector through a public-private partnership agreement. Public-private partnership does not mean the privatization of your water services. In a PPP, the state continues to be the owner of the water infrastructure and accountable for the provision of good drinking water to the people. With the PPP approach, your government sets the stage and drafts a first plan. You then launch a competitive tender to identify the best offer from a private partner who will finance, design, build, operate, and maintain the project. Your private partner recovers his initial investment through service fees paid by the government or by the users directly. Your role is to supervise the public service provision in the best interest of your citizens. The public-private partnership approach lets you plan your project over its entire life cycle, optimizing the use of available resources. With this approach, you tap the strengths of the private sector that knows better how to first attract and invest capital, how to avoid cost overruns, and lastly, how best to operate. Finally, public-private partnership allocates specific risks to the partner that's in a better position to manage them, and these are tailored to the individual project. You, as the public actor, are best suited to control such risks as permits, legal frameworks, and changes in jurisdiction and regulation. The private sector mitigates best risks related to design, cost-efficient investment, operation, and technology. Certain risks have to be shared between both the public and private sectors. For example, sufficient user demand for new projects, or force majeure. Public-private partnerships are complex legal and financial arrangements. To create a successful partnership, a government should implement a set of good governance principles. The most important of these are: put people first. Start with assessing user needs. Projects must be economically warranted and involve all concerned stakeholders. A competent and stable government partner is required to build administrative capacity for effectively negotiating and managing long-term collaborations with the private sector, to put in place adequate legal frameworks and regulations, and ensure transparent procurement policies. Assess all risks from the outset and allocate them appropriately between the public and the private sectors. Don't forget to mitigate any substantial risk to the environment. Public-private partnership can be compared to a football game, where the government sets the rules and acts as referee to ensure their compliance. Those in the private sector are then able to compete against each other on the football field, for the benefit of the spectators. The game ends with the expiry of the PPP contract and the handing over of the public service back into your hands. If your citizens were satisfied with the game, why not continue and organize the next tournament with fresh players?
Mm. Okay. Welcome back. I hope you clearly focused with the